In the sweltering, claustrophobic jungles of the Pacific between 1942 and 1945, a different kind of war was being fought. This wasn't the open fields of Europe. This was a brutal, intimate conflict where the enemy could be just feet away, hidden behind a curtain of impenetrable green. Engagements often happened at spitting distance, well under 30 yards, where a single moment of hesitation meant death. In this terrifying new theater of war, the United States Marine Corps unleashed a weapon that was primitive, brutal, and completely alien to their enemy: the 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. On paper, it was a game-changer, a tool so perfectly suited for jungle warfare that it should have become a legend. Yet it didn't. The story of the American shotgun in the Pacific isn't one of glorious victory. It's a story of a catastrophic failure, a weapon crippled by an invisible enemy, and a myth that grew to hide a shocking truth. The Japanese infantry never saw it coming, but what happened next is something the Marines would never forget. The Imperial Japanese Army was one of the most prepared fighting forces on the planet. They had spent decades meticulously studying their Western adversaries. Their intelligence officers and tacticians had dissected every piece of enemy hardware. Their training manuals were exhaustive, covering everything from the British Lee Enfield rifle and the American M1919 machine gun to French mortars and even Soviet submachine guns. They had a plan for everything, a counter for every move, but in all their thousands of pages of doctrine, in all their intense preparation, there was a glaring, almost laughable omission. They never once considered the combat shotgun. To them, it was a fowling piece, a tool for farmers and hunters, not a serious instrument of modern warfare. This single oversight, this cultural blind spot, should have been a fatal error. Because as the war began, America was gearing up to ship tens of thousands of them into military service. Nearly 20,000 Winchester Model 1897s and up to 80,000 of the newer Model 1912s. These weren't just shotguns, they were trench brooms, capable of sweeping a room, a trench, or a jungle path clear of life with terrifying efficiency. To understand why this weapon should have been so devastating, you have to understand the very soul of the Japanese military doctrine in 1942. It was built around a concept called Seishin Kyuiku, or spiritual power. This wasn't just empty propaganda, it was a deadly serious and calculated response to a harsh reality. Japan knew it could not compete with the United States industrially. In a single month, America's factories could produce more steel than Japan could in an entire year. The Imperial Army couldn't win a war of machines, so they decided to win a war of spirit. Their solution was to forge a soldier who was individually superior in the chaos of close combat. A warrior whose spirit, discipline, and mastery of the bayonet would triumph over the cold mechanics of Western warfare. The ultimate expression of this philosophy was the night infiltration attack. It was their signature move, honed to a razor's edge in the war against China, and used with terrifying success against the British in Malaya and the American defenders in the Philippines. The plan was as simple as it was deadly. Under the cloak of darkness, elite units would slip silently through enemy lines, creating chaos and confusion. Then, as dawn broke, a full frontal assault would commence, the infamous Banzai charge. Thousands of soldiers, screaming for their emperor, would rush forward with rifles and bayonets fixed, aiming to close the distance and turn the battle into a maelstrom of hand-to-hand combat. It was in this final, bloody crucible that they believed their spiritual superiority would be undeniable. And for a time, they were right. But this entire tactical framework, this entire philosophy of war, was built on one critical assumption: that they could get close. The American shotgun took that assumption and shattered it into a million pieces. Imagine a Japanese soldier, hyped on adrenaline, bayonet fixed, charging through the half-light of dawn. He's closing in on the American lines, ready for the final, honorable struggle. But instead of the crack of a single rifle, he's met with a deafening roar. A single Marine armed with a Winchester Model 97 could unleash hell. Thanks to a unique design feature called a slam fire, he didn't need to pull the trigger for each shot. He could simply hold it down and pump the action as fast as his arm could move. In about 2 seconds, he could fire 6 shells of .00 buckshot. Each of those shells contained 9 lead pellets, each one the diameter of a .33 caliber bullet. At 30 yards, that cloud of lead would spread to nearly 3 feet wide, creating a veritable wall of metal that was almost impossible to miss in the dense jungle. It wasn't just a gun. It was a force of nature. It didn't just kill you. It erased you. A weapon designed by the legendary John Browning, the Model 1897 was an old, simple, and brutally effective design. The military version, the trench gun, came with a shortened 20-inch barrel, a perforated heat shield, and a bayonet lug for the massive M1917 sword bayonet, as if it needed to be any more intimidating. It was soon joined by the newer, more refined Model 1912, which featured an internal hammer to prevent accidental discharges. Both models served side by side, becoming the tools that were meant to break the spirit of the Japanese charge. When the 1st Marine Division stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal in August 1942, they carried with them the first of these devastating weapons. This was America's first major offensive, its first step back in a long and bloody war. The fighting was savage, and the Japanese quickly resorted to their trusted night infiltration tactics. On August 21st, at the Battle of the Tanaru River, which was actually fought at Alligator Creek, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki led his elite detachment of 9-17 men in a direct assault on the Marine perimeter. It was a textbook Japanese attack, but it was met with a meat grinder of American firepower. The Japanese were virtually annihilated, with 789 men killed. History primarily credits the Browning machine guns and 37mm anti-tank guns firing canister rounds for the victory. But scattered among the foxholes were Marines clutching their shotguns. And for the Japanese soldiers who may have faced them at spitting distance, their war ended in a thunderous blast that their doctrine had never prepared them for. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, the shotgun found its purpose. It was the perfect weapon for guarding the perimeter at night, for walking point on a jungle patrol, ready to answer an ambush with an instantaneous storm of lead. But it was here, in the suffocating humidity of the jungle, that the shotgun's first and most critical flaw was exposed. It wasn't a flaw in the design or the tactics. It was a flaw in the ammunition itself, an enemy that no one had seen coming. The standard issue shotgun shells of the day were made with paper hulls. Back in the dry conditions of a training range in California, they worked perfectly. But in the 100% humidity of a Pacific jungle, they became a liability. The paper casings acted like a sponge, soaking up moisture from the air. They would swell, becoming bloated and soft. A shell that would have slid smoothly into the chamber a day earlier would now refuse to load. Marines reported having to hammer the pump forward just to get a round seated, an impossible task in the heat of combat. Suddenly, the perfect weapon was rendered useless, not by the enemy but by the very air they were breathing. This single, devastating problem would haunt the shotgun for most of the war. It nearly negated its effectiveness entirely. And that is why, when you dig into the history, you find a strange silence. This devastating ammunition problem is one of those crucial details that gets lost in the big picture retellings of the war. Understanding these hidden factors, the small things that have massive consequences, is what separates the real story of warfare from the Hollywood version. If you appreciate diving this deep and uncovering the details that truly define these conflicts, then make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We're just getting started on unraveling this mystery, and you won't want to miss what comes next. This catastrophic ammunition flaw persisted for years. It wasn't until March 29, 1945, with the war in its final, bloody months, that the military officially adopted the M19 all-brass shotgun shell. These moisture-proof brass cases finally restored the shotgun to its full, reliable potential. But for the men fighting on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Peleliu, that solution was years away. They were stuck with a weapon that was brilliant in theory but frustratingly unreliable in practice. This late adoption date is a huge clue as to why the shotgun's legend doesn't quite match the historical record. For most of the war, the men who carried them couldn't fully trust them. Many veterans of the Pacific, when writing their memoirs, barely mentioned the shotgun at all. Not because it wasn't there, but because for them, it was a constant source of frustration. Despite these issues, the military continued to train with them. Technical Manual TM9285, published in 1942, laid out the doctrine for a half-dozen different models from Winchester, Remington, and Stevens. At training camps across the United States, Marines mastered the shotgun's use in specific combat scenarios, guarding prisoners, clearing bunkers, and most importantly, acting as the point man on jungle patrols. They learned the brutal efficiency of the Model 97's slam fire, a technique that could empty the weapon in seconds. But they were also warned against it, as it ate through their limited ammunition supply and could quickly overheat the barrel. The official Marine Corps Table of Organization even authorized 306 shotguns for every Marine division. They were issued to specialized units, pioneer battalions, military police, and certain rifle squads. They were present in every major operation. But here's the catch. That number, 306, represented less than 2% of a division's total small arms. It was a specialized tool, not a standard-issue weapon, and that fact changes everything. Perhaps the most telling piece of evidence about the shotgun's real impact is something that didn't happen. In World War I, when American doughboys first brought the trench gun to the Western Front, the German government lodged a formal diplomatic protest. They claimed the shotgun was an illegal weapon that violated the Hague Convention by causing unnecessary suffering. They even threatened to execute any captured American soldier found carrying one. It created a massive international incident. Yet in World War II, Japan, a nation that had also signed the Hague Convention, said absolutely nothing. There were no diplomatic protests, no threats, no official complaints. In all the captured Japanese military documents, in all the post-war interrogations of high-ranking officers, the shotgun is a ghost. They talk at length about countering American machine guns, their terror of the flamethrower, and the overwhelming power of American artillery. But the shotgun? It's simply not there. This silence is deafening. It suggests that while individual Japanese soldiers certainly faced the terrifying blast of a trench gun, the weapon never made enough of a tactical impact to even warrant a footnote in their official reports. It wasn't a strategic threat. This wasn't because they weren't afraid of it. It was because they encountered it so rarely that it never registered as something they needed to develop a specific countertactic for. The Japanese were masters of adaptation. When they faced the M2 flamethrower, they developed new bunker designs and tactics to counter it. When they faced American tanks, they developed suicide tactics with magnetic mines. They adapted to survive. The fact that they never adapted to the shotgun tells us that it was never the threat popular culture has made it out to be. The campaign in New Guinea, fought from 1942 to 1945, should have been the shotgun's time to shine. The terrain was some of the most hellish on Earth, a dense, rain-soaked jungle where visibility was often just a few feet. Based on the early experiences in Guadalcanal, U.S. Army divisions fighting there specifically requested shipments of shotguns, believing they would be the perfect tool for the job. But the dream quickly turned into a logistical nightmare. The ammunition problem that had plagued the Marines in Guadalcanal was even worse in the highlands of New Guinea. The constant torrential rain, the endless river crossings, and the suffocating humidity made the paper-hulled shells almost completely useless. The weapons became unreliable liabilities. Many units that had eagerly requested the shotguns ended up leaving them behind in rear area armories, preferring the proven reliability of their M1 Garands, Thompson submachine guns, and Browning automatic rifles. The brutal reality of jungle warfare had exposed the weapon's fatal flaw. It was a lesson learned in blood. A perfect weapon on paper is worthless if it doesn't work in practice. As the war ground on, the Marines who did use shotguns developed a very specific, narrow doctrine for them. They were found to be most valuable in 3 distinct roles. First, as the point man on a patrol. The designated scout would carry the shotgun at the very front of the column, ready to react instantly to a sudden ambush. The wide spread of buckshot could suppress multiple attackers at once, buying the rest of the patrol the precious seconds they needed to deploy and return fire. It was a job that required immense courage, as the shotgunner often operated far ahead of his comrades. Second, they were used for night perimeter defense. Shotgunners would be placed at likely infiltration points, where the weapon's devastating pattern compensated for the pitch-black darkness. The distinctive shuck-shuck sound of a pump-action shotgun being cycled became a psychological weapon in itself, a terrifying warning to any enemy soldier creeping through the undergrowth. Finally, they were used for guarding prisoners, where their close-range power was an effective deterrent. But in all these roles, it was a specialist weapon, supported by riflemen who carried the primary load of the fighting. Even in the urban combat of Manila in 1944, where shotguns were specifically requested for the brutal house-to-house fighting, their role was limited. While they were devastating for clearing a room in a surprise encounter, the Japanese defenders were masters of fortification. They quickly learned to barricade themselves in positions that prevented the Americans from getting close, negating the shotgun's range advantage. The real workhorses of the urban battles were the flamethrowers and demolition charges that could destroy a fortified position from a distance. The same was true on Iwo Jima. The island's landscape of volcanic ash, deep caves, and interconnected tunnels was a nightmare. Here, the shotgun was almost completely useless. The battle was won by teams of Marines armed with flamethrowers, grenades, and satchel charges, methodically rooting out defenders from their underground lairs. The famous flag raising on Mount Suribachi happened after those positions were cleared by fire and explosives, not by shotgun assaults. And all the while, the Marines were still struggling with those damned swollen paper shells. The new brass ammunition wouldn't arrive until after the battle was over. It's one thing to read about these technical details and after-action reports, but uncovering these hidden truths, the real stories buried in forgotten archives and logistics forms, is a completely different kind of historical investigation. It's about piecing together a puzzle from incomplete evidence to find out what really happened. By the time the Battle of Okinawa began in April 1945, the reliable brass-cased ammunition had finally reached the front lines. The 1st and 6th Marine Divisions were now equipped with over 600 shotguns that they could finally trust. But it was too little too late. The nature of the war had changed. The Japanese commander on Okinawa, General Mitsuru Ushijima, had learned the lessons from the previous bloody campaigns. He forbade the reckless Banzai charges that had characterized the earlier fighting. Instead, he ordered his men to fight a defense in depth, using the island's rugged terrain and a complex system of fortified positions in the Shuri line to bleed the Americans dry. The fighting on Okinawa was a brutal, grinding war of attrition fought at longer ranges, from bunker to bunker, cave to cave. It was a battle dominated by tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers, not close-quarters shotgun duels. The shotgun had finally been perfected, but the type of war it was built for had already vanished. This disconnect is confirmed by the very men who fought the war. In the thousands of oral histories and interviews with Pacific War veterans stored in archives like the Library of Congress, the shotgun is a phantom. The great memoirs of the war, like Eugene Sledge's With the Old Breed and Robert Leckey's Helmet for My Pillow, are considered masterpieces of detail and accuracy. Both men were Marine riflemen who fought in the thick of it at places like Peleliu, Guadalcanal, and Okinawa. Neither of them mentions the combat shotgun a single time. Think about that. These men documented everything: the mud, the fear, the sounds, the smells, the specifics of their rifles and machine guns. But a weapon as dramatic as the trench gun doesn't even warrant a passing comment. Their silence speaks volumes. It tells us that for the average grunt, the shotgun was simply not a significant part of their combat experience. It was a peripheral tool, a footnote in a story dominated by the M1 Garand, the bar, and the flamethrower. This reality is starkly at odds with the weapons production numbers. American industry churned out military shotguns by the tens of thousands. Winchester, Remington, Stevens, Ithaca, they all contributed to the war effort. This incredible output demonstrated America's industrial might, but it creates a historical paradox. If so many were made, where did they all go? The answer is that combat was only one of their many jobs. Thousands of shotguns were used in training facilities back in the States. Thousands more were issued to military police for guarding prisoners and securing convoys. The Navy used them for security on ships and for boarding parties. Air bases used them for perimeter defense. These were all necessary, but non-combat roles. The shotgun was a tool of security and control as much as it was a weapon of assault. The mythologizing of the shotgun began after the war, largely thanks to Hollywood. Films depicted heroic Marines single-handedly clearing Japanese bunkers with their trench guns, creating a powerful and lasting public image that was almost entirely unsupported by the historical record. Video games and popular history books perpetuated this image, cementing the shotgun as an iconic weapon of the Pacific, even though the reality was far more mundane. When you compare the shotgun to the weapons that truly made a difference, the picture becomes even clearer. The M2 flamethrower, introduced in 1943, appears in virtually every account of bunker clearing. On Iwo Jima alone, Marines expended over 360,000 gallons of napalm, and its terrifying effectiveness is meticulously documented. By contrast, records of shotgun ammunition expenditure are conspicuously absent. The Browning automatic rifle, the bar, was the heart of the Marine Rifle Squad. By 1944, every squad had 3 of them, and there was detailed doctrine and training for their use. The shotgun, despite its theoretical place in the arsenal, never achieved that level of integration. It remained a specialist tool, a weapon on the sidelines. The logistics of supplying it were another nail in its coffin. A 12-gauge shell weighed twice as much as a rifle cartridge and took up 3 times the space. When every inch of a landing craft's cargo hold was precious, supply officers prioritized the ammunition that would serve the most men and have the greatest impact: rifle rounds, machine gun belts, and mortar shells. The bulky, specialized shotgun shells were a low priority. Veterans recall being issued just a box or two of shells that had to last for an entire operation. This scarcity naturally discouraged its use, pushing it further into a niche role. So, in the end, the story of the shotgun in the Pacific is not the one we think we know. It's not a story of a superweapon that terrified an unprepared enemy into submission. It's a much more complex and human story. It's a story of a brilliant idea crippled by a simple, unforeseen flaw. It's a story of logistics, of humidity, of doctrine, and of a war that changed faster than the weapons could keep up. The Japanese infantry never expected the 12-gauge shotgun, that much is true. But that surprise was ultimately irrelevant. They were defeated not by a single weapon, but by the overwhelming weight of America's industrial might, its superior logistics, and its mastery of combined arms warfare. They were defeated by artillery that could level mountains, by naval guns that could shatter fortifications from miles away, and by the relentless courage of individual riflemen. The shotgun was just a bit player in a vast, epic drama, its legend growing in the telling until it overshadowed the far more mundane and far more interesting truth. The real history shows us that the weapons that win wars aren't always the most dramatic or the most technologically advanced, but the ones that are reliable, versatile, and there in the numbers that matter when the shooting starts.